Hey guys, tonight we are going to dig our hands into the cool, dark soil of the past to uncover a root system of rebellion that you've probably never heard of. We're looking at 15 forgotten vegetables that were virtually erased from history, not because they tasted bad, but because they were actually too good at their jobs. Imagine a plant so resilient and easy to grow that it threatened the entire economic foundation of the Middle Ages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're drifting off from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing those timestamps roll in from everywhere. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a muddy field in 12th century Europe. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint, earthy scent of manure that just sort of permeates everything in this era. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the furrows of soil that you have spent the entire day breaking your back over. You are a serf, which is basically the medieval version of an unpaid intern with a lifetime contract and zero hope of promotion. Your entire existence revolves around one thing: grain, wheat, rye, barley. These aren't just crops, they are the currency of your life. They are the reason you wake up before dawn and the reason your knees ache when you lie down on your straw mattress at night. The feudal system, that great pyramid scheme of the Middle Ages, is built entirely on the production of grain. You grow it, but you don't own it. You have to harvest it, bundle it, and then, here's the kicker, you have to take it to the Lord's mill to grind it into flour. You can't just grind it yourself at home with a handstone. That's illegal. The Lord owns the mill, and he takes a cut of your flour as a tax. Then you have to bake your bread in the Lord's oven, because owning a private oven is often illegal too. He takes a cut for that as well. It's a brilliant system of control, really. It ensures that every calorie you consume is tracked, taxed, and authorized by the guy living in the big stone castle up on the hill. It's less like a grocery store and more like a subscription service you can never cancel, where the terms of service involve potential starvation. But imagine for a moment that you look down at the edge of the field, away from the neatly planted rows of wheat that demand so much of your sweat. There, growing wild in the ditch, is something else. It's green, leafy, and lush. It didn't need you to plow the earth for it. It didn't ask for fertilizer. It doesn't care if there was a drought last month or if the frost came early. It just grows, defiant and cheerful, like a teenager refusing to clean their room. This is the threat of the independent salad. Historians have long understood that the transition to agriculture was a trade-off. We got more food, but we worked harder for it. But there is a fascinating, darker layer to this story regarding what we chose to grow, and more importantly, what we were told not to grow. In the medieval mind, specifically the mind of the ruling class, food that grew too easily was suspicious. It was dangerous. If you could walk into the forest or the edge of a roadside and gather a basket full of nutritious roots and greens that required zero labor and zero processing, why would you spend 12 hours a day farming wheat for the Lord? An independent food source meant an independent peasant, and an independent peasant was a terrifying concept to a feudal lord. The entire social order relied on you being dependent. You needed the Lord's land to survive, and in exchange, you gave him your labor and your loyalty. If you could feed yourself with a patch of hardy, perennial vegetables that grew like weeds behind your hut, the leverage of the aristocracy would begin to crumble. It's a bit like if someone invented a car that ran on tap water today. The oil companies wouldn't exactly be throwing a parade. They would probably try to convince you that water cars were dangerous, uncool, or illegal. And that is exactly what happened with these vegetables. We tend to think of the lost vegetables of history as things that just fell out of fashion, like shag carpet or gelatin-based salads in the 1950s, but it wasn't just a matter of taste, it was structural. Many of the plants we are going to talk about were staples for the poor because they were incredibly high yield and low maintenance. They were the ultimate survival foods. But because they couldn't be easily monetized, stored in a granary, or taxed at a mill, they were pushed to the margins. There is actually an open debate among agricultural historians about whether this erasure was a conscious and top-down conspiracy or just a byproduct of cultural drift. Did the lords sit around a heavy oak table, drinking wine and plotting to ban the parsnip? Probably not. It wasn't that dramatic. It was more subtle. It was a shift in status. The foods that required complex processing, white bread, roasted meats, wines, became symbols of civilization and high status. The foods that you could just pull out of the dirt and eat, roots, bitter greens, wild herbs, became associated with poverty, roughness, and animal behavior. To eat them was to admit you were outside the system. Think about the sheer calorie-to-labor ratio of grain. It's terrible. You have to plow, sow, weed, wait, harvest, thresh, winnow, grind, and bake. It is an exhausted process. It's the agricultural equivalent of a long-distance relationship. You put in a ton of effort for very specific moments of reward. In contrast, many of the forgotten medieval vegetables we'll discuss are perennials. You plant them once, and they come back every year, like that one friend who crashes on your couch and never really leaves. They are self-seeding, frost-resistant, and pest-tolerant. In a rational world, these would be the superstars of agriculture. They are efficient, they are resilient, but feudalism wasn't about efficiency for the user. It was about control for the provider. A peasant with a cellar full of untaxable root vegetables is a peasant who might decide he doesn't need to work the Lord's domain on Tuesday. He might decide he has enough energy to ask for better rights. He might realize that the system isn't protecting him, it's just managing him. So as we walk through this garden of ghosts, keep in mind that we aren't just looking at botany. We are looking at a political struggle fought with leaves and tubers. We are looking at how the menu was manipulated to keep people in their place. It's a story of how weeds were actually freedom fighters with chlorophyll, and how the potato eventually won the war, but only after centuries of suspicion. The air in your medieval village is getting colder now, and the sun has fully set. You can hear the distant sound of the church bell ringing, the only clock you have ever known, and another reminder of the authorities that watch over your schedule. You are hungry. The wheat harvest is months away. But in the shadows of the hedgerow, something is growing. It's not wheat. It's not barley. It's something green, crunchy, and completely free. And that is why it has to go. Hey guys, tonight we are going to dig our hands into the cool, dark soil of the past to uncover a root system of rebellion that you've probably never heard of. We're looking at 15 forgotten vegetables that were virtually erased from history, not because they tasted bad, but because they were actually too good at their jobs. Imagine a plant so resilient and easy to grow that it threatened the entire economic foundation of the Middle Ages. We're also going to peek behind the stone walls of medieval convents to see what happened when human nature clashed with strict vows, and finally, we'll mix some questionable potions in the ancient world's search for love. It sounds cozy, but let's be honest. Without modern antibiotics or a functioning democracy, you probably wouldn't last a week in this world. The salad might be free, but the bubonic plague is the dressing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're drifting off from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing those timestamps roll in from everywhere. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a muddy field in 12th century Europe. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint, earthy scent of manure that just sort of permeates everything in this era. The sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the furrows of soil that you have spent the entire day breaking your back over. You are a serf, which is basically the medieval version of an unpaid intern with a lifetime contract and zero hope of promotion. Your entire existence revolves around one thing: grain, wheat, rye, barley. These aren't just crops, they are the currency of your life. They are the reason you wake up before dawn, and the reason your knees ache when you lie down on your straw mattress at night. The feudal system, that great pyramid scheme of the Middle Ages, is built entirely on the production of grain. You grow it, but you don't own it. You have to harvest it, bundle it, and then, here's the kicker, you have to take it to the Lord's mill to grind it into flour. You can't just grind it yourself at home with a handstone. That's illegal. The Lord owns the mill, and he takes a cut of your flour as a tax. Then you have to bake your bread in the Lord's oven, because owning a private oven is often illegal too. He takes a cut for that as well. It's a brilliant system of control, really. It ensures that every calorie you consume is tracked, taxed, and authorized by the guy living in the big stone castle up on the hill. It's less like a grocery store and more like a subscription service you can never cancel, where the terms of service involve potential starvation. But imagine for a moment that you look down at the edge of the field, away from the neatly planted rows of wheat that demand so much of your sweat. There, growing wild in the ditch, is something else. It's green, leafy, and lush. It didn't need you to plow the earth for it. It didn't ask for fertilizer. It doesn't care if there was a drought last month or if the frost came early. It just grows, defiant and cheerful, like a teenager refusing to clean their room. This is the threat of the independent salad. Historians have long understood that the transition to agriculture was a trade-off. We got more food, but we worked harder for it. But there is a fascinating, darker layer to this story regarding what we chose to grow, and more importantly, what we were told not to grow. In the medieval mind, specifically the mind of the ruling class, food that grew too easily was suspicious. It was dangerous. If you could walk into the forest or the edge of a roadside and gather a basket full of nutritious roots and greens that required zero labor and zero processing, why would you spend 12 hours a day farming wheat for the Lord? An independent food source meant an independent peasant, and an independent peasant was a terrifying concept to a feudal lord. The entire social order relied on you being dependent. You needed the Lord's land to survive, and in exchange, you gave him your labor and your loyalty. If you could feed yourself with a patch of hardy, perennial vegetables that grew like weeds behind your hut, the leverage of the aristocracy would begin to crumble. It's a bit like if someone invented a car that ran on tap water today. The oil companies wouldn't exactly be throwing a parade. They would probably try to convince you that water cars were dangerous, uncool, or illegal. And that is exactly what happened with these vegetables. We tend to think of the lost vegetables of history as things that just fell out of fashion, like shag carpet or gelatin-based salads in the 1950s. But it wasn't just a matter of taste. It was structural. Many of the plants we are going to talk about were staples for the poor because they were incredibly high yield and low maintenance. They were the ultimate survival foods. But because they couldn't be easily monetized, stored in a granary, or taxed at a mill, they were pushed to the margins. There is actually an open debate among agricultural historians about whether this erasure was a conscious and top-down conspiracy or just a byproduct of cultural drift. Did the lords sit around a heavy oak table, Drinking wine and plotting to ban the parsnip? Probably not. It wasn't that dramatic. It was more subtle. It was a shift in status. The foods that required complex processing, white bread, roasted meats, wines, became symbols of civilization and high status. The foods that you could just pull out of the dirt and eat, roots, bitter greens, wild herbs, became associated with poverty, roughness, and animal behavior. To eat them was to admit you were outside the system. Think about the sheer calorie-to-labor ratio of grain. It's terrible. You have to plow, sow, weed, wait, harvest, thresh, winnow, grind, and bake. It is an exhausted process. It's the agricultural equivalent of a long-distance relationship. You put in a ton of effort for very specific moments of reward. In contrast, many of the forgotten medieval vegetables we'll discuss are perennials. You plant them once, and they come back every year, like that one friend who crashes on your couch and never really leaves. They are self-seeding, frost-resistant, and pest-tolerant. In a rational world, these would be the superstars of agriculture. They are efficient, they are resilient, but feudalism wasn't about efficiency for the user. It was about control for the provider. A peasant with a cellar full of untaxable root vegetables is a peasant who might decide he doesn't need to work the Lord's domain on Tuesday. He might decide he has enough energy to ask for better rights. He might realize that the system isn't protecting him, it's just managing him. So as we walk through this garden of ghosts, keep in mind that we aren't just looking at botany. We are looking at a political struggle fought with leaves and tubers. We are looking at how the menu was manipulated to keep people in their place. It's a story of how weeds were actually freedom fighters with chlorophyll, and how the potato eventually won the war, but only after centuries of suspicion. The air in your medieval village is getting colder now, and the sun has fully set. You can hear the distant sound of the church bell ringing, the only clock you have ever known, and another reminder of the authorities that watch over your schedule. You are hungry. The wheat harvest is months away. But in the shadows of the hedgerow, something is growing. It's not wheat. It's not barley. It's something green, crunchy, and completely free. And that is why it has to go. You are standing at the edge of the field again, but this time, the sky isn't a painted backdrop of golden sunset. It is a bruised purple, heavy with clouds that refuse to rain, or perhaps it's been raining for 40 days straight. The weather in the Middle Ages was the original arbiter of fate, long before algorithms decided what you saw on your feed. You look at the wheat, it's pathetic. The stalks are short, yellowing, and shriveled, looking like they gave up on life about 3 weeks ago. This is the nightmare scenario. This is the moment where the delicate contract of feudalism usually kicks in. The harvest fails, you starve, and you beg the church or the Lord for relief from the stores. But you, the savvy peasant with dirt under your fingernails and a healthy distrust of authority, you have a backup plan. You turn your back on the dying wheat, walk down toward the rocky, windswept coast, or perhaps just the gravelly edge of a Roman road, and you find it, sea kale, crambe maritima. It sounds like a spell, but it's actually a tank of a vegetable. It doesn't look like much at first glance. It's got these thick, waxy, blue-green leaves that look more like they belong in a prehistoric diorama than a salad bowl. It grows in shingle, which is just a fancy word for piles of useless rocks, and it drinks salt spray for breakfast. While the wheat is having a nervous breakdown because the soil pH is slightly off, sea kale is thriving in conditions that would kill a lesser plant in 20 minutes. This is the essence of the unkillable weed. It represents a biological resilience that the medieval economy simply wasn't designed to handle. The entire system relied on the fragility of agriculture. If the crops were fragile, you were fragile. If you were fragile, you were obedient. But plants like sea kale and its inland cousins like purslane were the agricultural equivalent of that one guy who wears shorts in a blizzard and says he's fine. They simply refused to die. Let's talk about purslane for a second. You've probably stepped on it. It grows in the cracks of sidewalks today, lying flat against the ground like a green doily woven by a spider. In the medieval period, it was everywhere. It has succulent, fleshy leaves and reddish stems. You can tear it out, throw it on a compost heap, and if there is even a hint of moisture, it will reroot itself and keep growing. It is practically immortal. To a peasant, this was a miracle. It was crunchy, slightly lemony, and, unbeknownst to them, packed with omega-3 fatty acids. It was a superfood masquerading as a nuisance. But to the Lord looking down from his high tower, these plants were problematic. Why? Because they turned the wasteland into a pantry. The feudal map was divided into the arable land, the good stuff, owned and taxed, and the waste, the forests, swamps, and rocky shores. The waste was supposed to be useless, scary, and unproductive. But if you knew what you were looking for, the waste was actually a buffet. Sea kale, specifically, is fascinating because it's a perennial that effectively clones itself. You can cut the shoots in the spring. They taste a bit like a cross between asparagus and cabbage, and the plant just shrugs and grows more for next year. It requires 0 plowing, 0 sowing, 0 threshing. And this brings us to a quirky little biological detail. Sea kale seeds are encased in cork-like shells that allow them to float. They can drift across the ocean for days, land on a barren beach, and start a new colony. It is a vegetable with a built-in life raft. It is completely independent of human intervention. Compare that to wheat, which is essentially a biological toddler that needs constant supervision, protection from predators, and a very specific bedtime routine, or else it throws a tantrum and dies. The resilience of these plants challenged the narrative of famine. We often read historical accounts of famine foods, where chroniclers describe peasants forced to eat roots and weeds because the grain failed. But some historians argue whether these were truly desperate last resorts, or if that was just how the literate elite described a diet they didn't understand. If you are a monk writing a history of the year 1250 and you see people eating sea kale, you might write, the poor souls were reduced to eating wild brush, but the peasant might have been thinking, finally, the wheat is dead, I can eat the good stuff that doesn't taste like cardboard. There is a subversive power in a food source that doesn't care about the economy. When the Great Famine of 1315 hit, shifting weather patterns turned fields into mud baths. Grain rotted in the ground. The price of bread skyrocketed. People panicked, but the weeds didn't care about the rain. In fact, many leafy greens love a bit of extra water. The peasant who knew the secret value of the wasteland had a buffer against the chaos. They had a secret savings account of calories that the taxman couldn't audit. This resilience made these plants culturally invisible to the elite, yet physically omnipresent for the poor. It created a dual reality. There was the official reality. The kingdom is starving. And there was the unofficial reality. We are having sea kale soup again. The friction between these two worlds is where the tension lies. If you don't need the system to survive, do you really need the system at all? It's important to visualize the texture of this life. You are trudging back from the shingle beach, your boots sliding on wet stones. The wind is biting your face, making your nose run, but your basket is heavy. Inside, beneath a layer of old sacking to hide it from prying eyes, are bundles of pale, purple-tipped kale shoots. You didn't pay for them. You didn't ask permission for them. You just took them. Later, inside your small, smoke-filled hut, you'll boil them. Maybe you have a little bit of saved butter, or more likely just some animal fat. The smell is sulfurous but comforting, a deep green aroma that fills the room. It's not the dry, dusty smell of flour. It's the smell of life that persists against the odds. This is why independence was a threat. The feudal system was a machine designed to convert labor into status for the few. It worked best when the inputs, the laborers, had no other options. These resilient vegetables were loopholes in the contract. They were the open source software in a world of proprietary operating systems. They allowed you to opt out, even if just for a meal or two, and the authorities knew it on some level. They didn't have the botanical vocabulary to explain why they hated these plants, so they used cultural shame instead. They called them coarse. They said they caused melancholy or bad humors. They framed the resilience of the plant as a negative trait. Only a beast would eat something that grows in a ditch. It was a clever bit of marketing. Convince the starving man that the free food at his feet is beneath his dignity, and he will keep working himself to death for the expensive food that is out of his reach. As you finish your bowl of sea kale soup in the dark, listening to the rain hammer against the thatched roof, you realize that you are surviving. The wheat is dead, the Lord is panicking, but you are full. It's a small victory, a quiet rebellion of digestion. But in a world built on dependence, a full belly that you filled yourself is a dangerous thing. You are standing in the doorway of your cottage, wiping your hands on a rough woolen tunic that has seen better decades, let alone days. Down the muddy track that serves as the main streets of your village, you see him. He is riding a horse, which immediately sets him apart from everyone else you know, and he is holding a book. In the Middle Ages, a man on a horse with a sword is scary, but a man on a horse with a book is terrifying. It is the tax assessor, or perhaps the Lord's steward. His title doesn't matter as much as his function. He is here to count. Taxation in this era isn't a subtle deduction from a paycheck you never see. It is a physical, invasive audit of your survival. The steward rides through the fields, counting the shocks of wheat, the bushels of barley, the head of cattle, and the pigs rooting in the forest. He is calculating the tithe, the 10% for the church, and the Lord's share. Grain is the absolute worst crop to have when this guy shows up, because grain is a snitch. It stands tall, golden, and high visibility. It screams, "Look at me. I am right here. Count me." You can't hide a field of wheat. It is the most transparent asset you own, and therefore it is the most heavily taxed. But you, being a person of subtle genius and survival instinct, have a secret. You watch the steward ride past your small, fenced-in garden patch. He glances at it, wrinkles his nose, and makes a mark in his ledger that effectively says negligible. He sees a tangle of green leaves, some dirt, and what looks like weeds growing near the compost heap. He sees zero value. He rides on. You let out a breath you didn't know you were holding. Because right there, beneath the soil, and disguised as yard trimmings, is a calorie gold mine that just committed tax evasion. Let's talk about Skirit, Secum cicerum. If you saw it today at a high-end grocery store, you would probably assume it was a parsnip that had been involved in a terrible radioactive accident. It doesn't grow as a single clean taproot. Instead, it grows as a twisted, gnarled clump of roots that look remarkably like a bunch of arthritic fingers grasping at the dirt. It is not pretty. It does not have shelf appeal. But Skirit has a secret weapon, sugar. Before the arrival of sugar cane from the tropics, or the industrial refinement of sugar beets in the 19th century, Europe was a place starved for sweetness. Honey was expensive and controlled. Fruit was seasonal. Skirit, however, was incredibly sweet. It was known as sugar root. When you boil it, it tastes like a carrot that fell in love with a sweet potato. Here is the brilliance of Skirit as a tax haven. It lives underground. The steward can count the sheep because they are walking around. He can count the wheat sheaves because they are stacked. But he cannot count the Skirit roots. He has no idea if you have 10 pounds of it or 100 pounds of it, buried beneath that innocent-looking foliage. It is an invisible asset, unless he is willing to get off his horse, grab a spade, and start digging up your backyard, which he won't do because he has nice boots and a schedule to keep. He has to ignore it. So, while the neighbors are weeping over their lost bushels of barley, you are planning a feast. But there is a catch. There is always a catch in medieval botany. Skirret has a texture issue. Running through the center of each sweet root suck is a tough, woody core, almost like a piece of timber. To eat it, you have to boil the roots and then carefully pull the flesh off the inner bone or smash it through a sieve. It is a high-maintenance vegetable. It requires patience. Historians still argue about why skirret vanished from our plates. The mainstream theory is that the potato arrived and just did the job better. No woody core, bigger yield. But there is a fringe theory that suggests skirret was a victim of its own labor intensity. As society sped up, nobody had time to debone their vegetables anymore. We traded flavor for convenience, which is basically the history of food in one sentence. But skirret isn't the only co-conspirator in your garden. Look over there, growing aggressively near the outhouse or the manure pile. It's a plant with arrow-shaped leaves, covered in a strange, sandy dust that feels like flour when you rub it between your fingers. This is Good King Henry, Blightum bonus Henricus. It sounds like the name of a benevolent monarch, but it's actually a spinach substitute that is tougher than old leather boots if you don't pick it young. Its superpower is camouflage. To the untrained eye, Good King Henry looks exactly like a generic, non-edible weed. It blends in perfectly with nettles and docks. It thrives in nitrogen-rich soil, which is a polite way of saying it loves growing in filth. If you have a pile of compost or a spot where the animals do their business, Good King Henry will set up shop there and flourish. The tax steward looks at that corner of your yard. He sees a patch of weeds growing out of a dung heap. He thinks, disgusting peasant squalor. You think, infinite spinach. You can eat the leaves like spinach. You can cook the flower spikes like broccoli. It comes back every year without fail. It is a vegetable that requires you to humiliate yourself slightly to harvest it, standing knee-deep in the muck. But the reward is food that the state cannot see. It is the dark money of the medieval diet. There is a delightful, quirky debate among etymologists about where the name Good King Henry actually comes from. You might assume it's named after Henry III of France, who was a popular guy. But some folklore scholars suggest that Henry might actually refer to a Heinz or Heinrich, which are names often associated with household goblins or sprites in Germanic folklore. In this interpretation, the plant is named after a good goblin, a helpful spirit of the homestead. It fits perfectly. It's a mischievous, slightly magical plant that helps the poor survive by hiding in plain sight, right under the nose of the authorities. The beauty of these invisible vegetables is that they allowed for a private life. In a feudal system, privacy is a luxury. The Lord owns the land, the church owns your soul, and the village gossip owns your reputation. But what you dig up from the dirt in the dark of the evening is yours. Imagine the sensory satisfaction of that evening meal. You have had to give away the best of your grain. The barn feels empty, the village is anxious, but you have a pot bubbling over the fire. You toss in the skirret roots, watching the water turn slightly milky as the sugars release. You chop up the Good King Henry leaves, which wilt down into a dark, rich green. The smell is earthy, sweet, and vegetal. It doesn't smell like poverty. It smells like a secret. You sit on your three-legged stool, the wood hard against your back, and you take a bite. The skirret is sweet. a burst of energy that wakes up your tired brain. The greens are iron-rich and filling. You are eating the loopholes of the law. You are consuming the things that were too wild to be taxed, too crude to be counted. The tax steward is probably back in the castle by now, drinking wine and complaining about how little he collected, scribbling numbers into his book that represent the sum total of the village's worth. But his numbers are wrong. He missed the sugar in the ground. He missed the spinach in the weeds. He missed the resilience of people who know how to look at a patch of dirt and see a pantry. As you finish your bowl, scraping the last bit of sweet mash with a piece of dark bread, you feel a heavy, drowsy contentment settling into your bones. It's the specific, smug tiredness of someone who has outsmarted the system, even if just by a few calories. The fire dies down to embers, casting a dull red glow on the floor, and outside, the invisible vegetables keep growing in the dark, waiting for tomorrow. You wake up in the gray, pre-dawn light, and immediately you know that something is wrong. It's not the rooster crowing, and it's not the cold draft seeping through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. It's your stomach. It feels like a small, angry badger is trying to dig its way out of your intestines. In the modern world, you would stumble to the bathroom cabinet, pop a chalky pink tablet, and go back to bed. But here, in the year 1250, illness is a metaphysical crisis. If you are sick, it's not just biology, it's a narrative event. You have 3 options, and they range from expensive to terrifying. Option 1, you call a doctor. If you can even find one in your rural village, he is going to charge you a fortune to look at a flask of your urine, consult a star chart, and then probably tell you that your humors are out of balance. His solution will likely involve bloodletting, which is the medical equivalent of trying to fix a computer virus by smashing the monitor with a hammer. It's aggressive, it makes a mess, and it doesn't solve the problem. Option 2, you go to the priest. He will tell you that the stomach ache is likely a result of that envy you felt towards the miller's new hat last Sunday. The cure is prayer, fasting, which to be fair might actually help a stomach ache, and a donation to the church roof fund. Option 3, you ignore the institutions of power entirely. You wrap your wool cloak tight around your shivering shoulders, step out into the dew-soaked morning, and walk to the back of your garden. You are going to the pharmacy that doesn't charge a copay. This is the era of the physic garden. We tend to think of gardens today as aesthetic spaces, places where we try to keep hydrangeas alive. But for a medieval peasant, the garden was a toolkit. It was a survival station, and the plants growing there were doing double duty as food and medicine, blurring the line between dinner and prescription. Standing tall in the corner, towering over the other herbs like a green skyscraper, is lovage, Levisticum officinale. If you have never seen lovage, imagine a celery stalk that decided to start lifting weights and taking steroids. It can grow up to 2 meters tall. It is a beast of a plant. And the smell? It is intense. If you brush against it, the air fills with a scent that is savory, yeasty, and deeply aromatic. It smells like concentrated soup stock. In fact, if you know the modern condiment Maggi or a really strong bouillon cube, that is the ghost of lovage haunting your nostrils. Lovage was the ultimate independent medicine. It was a digestive powerhouse in a diet that consisted of roughly 80% heavy grains, beans, and dubious salted meats. Indigestion and bloating weren't just uncomfortable, they were a way of life. A tea made from lovage seeds or roots was the medieval equivalent of an antacid. It settled the badger in your stomach. It warmed the gut. But its utility went further, which made it even more annoying to the authorities. Lovage was an antiseptic and a deodorant. In a world where bathing was an infrequent luxury and everyone wore wool that trapped odors, People would put lovage leaves in their shoes to revive their tired feet and mask the smell. It was a plant that allowed you to maintain your dignity without paying a merchant for expensive spices or perfumes from the East. The church and the emerging medical guilds had a complicated relationship with these plants. On one hand, monasteries were famous for their herb gardens, but on the other hand, they wanted to be the gatekeepers of healing. They wanted you to come to the infirmary they ran. When a peasant cured themselves with a weed from their own backyard, they were bypassing the professional hierarchy. They were effectively saying, I don't need your theory of humors. I just need this leaf. And then, growing low to the ground with fuzzy, prickly leaves, there is borage, Borago officinalis. If lovage is the sturdy utilitarian worker, borage is the magical optimist. It has these shocking, brilliant blue star-shaped flowers that look like they fell out of a Disney movie. They are almost too blue to be real. The medievals believed borage had a very specific medical property. It cured sadness. The old saying went, I, borage, bring courage. It was the medieval antidepressant. If you were feeling melancholy, which was a legitimate medical diagnosis involving an excess of black bile, you would steep borage leaves and flowers in wine. Now, historians debate this one vigorously. Was it the borage that cheered people up, or was it the wine? It's a valid question, but modern chemical analysis has shown that borage actually contains small amounts of fatty acids and alkaloids that can have a mild adrenal effect. So maybe it wasn't just the booze talking, but think about the implication of this. If you could manage your own mental health, if you could lift the fog of depression with a flower that grows like a weed in the rubble, you were less reliant on the priest to absolve your sorrow. You were taking ownership of your own emotional state. There was a distinct gender element to this too. The backyard pharmacy was often the domain of women. The knowledge of which roots stopped a fever or which leaf eased a cramp was passed down from mother to daughter, orally, outside the written records of the universities. This made it unofficial knowledge, and in the eyes of the establishment, unofficial knowledge is just one step away from heresy or witchcraft. The line between wise woman with a garden and dangerous witch was terrifyingly thin and often depended entirely on how much the local authorities liked you. If you cured your neighbor's cow with a poultice, you were a helpful neighbor. If the cow died, or if the neighbor got jealous, that same poultice was evidence of dark magic. The medical establishment, such as it was, spent centuries trying to professionalize healing, which largely meant excluding women and excluding free remedies. They wrapped medicine in Latin, a language you couldn't read. They created complex theories that required a university degree to understand. They turned healing into a transaction. But the plants didn't care about Latin. Lovage grew just as tall for a serf as it did for a bishop. Borage bloomed its electric blue flowers, regardless of who planted it. As you stand there in the garden, chewing on a piece of lovage roots, the fire in your belly starts to cool down. The spicy, celery-like flavor numbs the pain. You take a few leaves of borage to float in your morning ale, just to take the edge off the existential dread of being a peasant. You look back at the village. The doctor is still asleep in his warm bed. The priest is preparing for morning mass. You didn't need either of them. You fixed yourself with the green knowledge that the earth provided for free. It feels like a small theft, stealing your own health back from the hands of fate and finance. The sun finally breaks the horizon, hitting the dew on the borage leaves, making them sparkle like little jagged diamonds. You feel a little better. You feel a little braver. And in a world designed to keep you small, afraid, and dependent, a little bit of courage, even if it comes from a fuzzy leaf, is a revolutionary thing. You are sitting on a rough wooden bench in the village tavern, or perhaps just a barn where someone has tapped a keg of ale. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and roasting onions. You are listening to a traveler, maybe a merchant's servant or a herald, talking about the feast he saw at the Duke's castle last week. He describes the table. It wasn't just food, it was architecture. There were swans roasted and put back into their feathers to look alive. There were peacocks breathing fire. There were jellies dyed to look like stained glass. And most importantly, there was white bread, bread so fine, so sifted, so incredibly uselessly pure that it looked like a cloud. You look down at your own bowl. It is filled with a dark, lumpy pottage of boiled roots, broad beans, and those weeds we talked about earlier. Suddenly, you don't feel resourceful or independent. You feel embarrassed. This is where the war against the independent vegetable moves from the physical battlefield to the psychological one. The authorities realized that they didn't need to burn the fields of skirret or sea kale to get rid of them. They just needed to make you ashamed to eat them. They weaponized taste. In the Middle Ages, the menu was strictly hierarchical, based on a concept known as the Great Chain of Being. This was a philosophical belief that the universe was organized in a vertical ladder, from the lowest rocks up to God. Everything had a place, and crucially, you were what you ate. Here's how the logic worked. Things that grew in the ground, roots, tubers, garlic, onions, and low-growing greens were considered earthy. They belonged to the element of earth. Therefore, they were heavy, coarse, and suitable only for people who were also earthy, i.e., you, the peasant who digs in the mud. If a noble ate a turnip, it was believed that the heavy, gross humors of the vegetable would drag his delicate, refined spirit down into the mud. Conversely, things that grew high up, fruit on trees, berries on bushes, were closer to the air. And things that flew, birds, swans, herons, were the highest of all. Therefore, the aristocracy ate fruit and birds. They literally ate the sky, while you were forced to eat the dirt. This wasn't just a culinary preference, it was a medical and moral doctrine. Doctors of the time, following Galenic principles, argued that the food of the poor caused melancholy and sluggishness. They claimed that eating root vegetables made your mind slow and your spirit dull. It's a brilliant piece of circular logic. The peasants are stupid because they eat roots. They eat roots because they are peasants. Therefore, the social order is biologically justified. This propaganda was incredibly effective. It turned survival foods into symbols of shame. Take the example of the humble turnip or the skirret root. In times of famine, everyone ate them. But the moment the harvest improved, the rich dropped them immediately. To continue eating them when you didn't have to was an admission of failure. It was a signal to your neighbors that you were still in crisis mode. We see this linguistic shift in the words used to describe these foods. They went from being sustenance to being famine food or fodder. The ultimate insult for a vegetable was to be reclassified as animal feed. Fit only for pigs was the death sentence for a crop's popularity. Once a vegetable was associated with the trough, no self-respecting human wanted it on their plate. Consider the acorns. In the ancient world, and even in some early medieval cultures, ground acorn flour was a staple. It was free, abundant, and nutritious. But by the High Middle Ages, eating acorns was the ultimate symbol of the savage, the wild man, or the pig. To eat an acorn was to resign from civilization. This weaponization of taste created a fascinating aspiration among the poor. You didn't want to be independent, you wanted to be dependent on the right things. You wanted to buy the white bread from the baker, even if it cost 3 times as much as your homemade rye loaf, because white bread meant you were civilized. It meant you weren't a dirt eater. Historians debate how much of this was a deliberate strategy of control versus a natural evolution of fashion. Did the lords explicitly say, let's make them hate their own food so they buy ours? Probably not in those exact words, but the result was the same. The cultural pressure acted as a soft power that dismantled the self-sufficient pantry. Imagine you are a mother in a medieval village. You have a patch of good King Henry growing by the fence. It's free spinach. But the village gossip has started calling it beggar's weed. She says that the miller's wife is buying spinach seeds from the market now, a proper variety that doesn't grow in dung. Do you keep feeding your children the beggar's weed, or do you tear it out, afraid of the stigma, and try to buy the market seeds? Slowly, the weeds were exiled from the garden. They were pushed back to the edges, then to the roadside, and finally they were forgotten entirely. We traded biological resilience for social acceptance. We stopped eating the plants that could survive a drought because we wanted to eat the plants that made us look rich. There is a tragic irony here. The coarse vegetables of the poor were often vastly more nutritious than the refined diet of the rich. The wealthy, with their meat-heavy fruit and wine diets, suffered terribly from gout, scurvy, and digestive issues. They were literally rotting from the inside out because they refused to eat a vegetable that had touched the dirt. Meanwhile, the peasant, provided they weren't in active starvation, often had a better vitamin intake simply because they were eating a wider variety of trash greens. But nutrition didn't matter. Perception mattered, and the perception was that independence was crude. The chain of being also applied to preparation. The poor ate raw or boiled foods, simple, crude. The rich ate roasted, spiced, and processed foods, complex, refined. To eat a raw onion was considered an act of aggression against polite society. It was something a laborer did in the field. To be civilized, you had to cook the life out of everything, drown it in sauce, and disguise its origin. You had to pretend it didn't come from the earth. As the centuries ground on, this pressure intensified. By the time we reached the early modern period, many of the vegetables we discussed, skirret, lovage, Alexander's sea kale, had largely vanished from the standard diet. They lingered on only in the most remote rural areas, eaten by the backward people who didn't know better. You finish your bowl of pottage in the tavern. It sits heavy in your stomach, the gross humors of the earth doing their work, according to the doctor. You look at the empty bowl and feel a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. The food kept you alive, yes, but it also marked you. It stained you with the color of the soil. You resolve that next year, if the harvest is good, you won't eat the roots. You'll buy the white flour, you'll buy the proper garden peas, you'll participate in the economy of prestige. You are willing to trade your security for a little bit of status. And in that decision, made by millions of people over hundreds of years, the independent salad was finally defeated. The trap was never just the law or the tax. The trap was the desire to be something other than what we were. We laid down our best tools because we were told they looked ugly in our hands. You are standing on a hill looking down at the valley where your grandfather used to graze his cow. For generations, literally, for as long as anyone in your family can remember, this land was the commons. It was a patchwork of open fields, scrubland, and forest edges that belonged to everyone and no one. It was the messy, chaotic, shared living room of the village. It was where you went to gather firewood, where you let your pig root for acorns, and where you picked the wild salad greens we've been talking about. But today, the view is different. A scar has been drawn across the landscape. It's a hedge, a thick, impenetrable wall of hawthorn and bramble, planted with military precision. And behind that hedge, there are sheep, thousands of them. This is the beginning of the end for the independent peasant. This is the era of enclosure. If the weaponization of taste was the psychological war against self-sufficiency, Enclosure was the nuclear option. It was the physical restructuring of the world to make independence illegal. For centuries, the feudal system was oppressive, yes, but it was also porous. There were gaps. There were customary rights. If a tree fell in the forest, the wood belonged to the person who picked it up. If berries grew on a bush, they were lunch. If you wanted to plant a patch of skirret on the edge of the common, nobody really cared. The land was viewed as a resource to be used, not a geometric shape to be owned exclusively. But then, the lords realized that wool was worth more than people. The textile industry was booming in Flanders and Italy. They needed massive amounts of wool, and to get wool, you need sheep. And sheep, unlike peasants, need large, uninterrupted grazing spaces. They don't want to share the land with your pig or your vegetable patch. So the lords began to enclose the land. They passed laws, often literally just voting for their own interests in a parliament you weren't invited to, that stripped away the customary rights of the poor. They took the common land, drew a line around it, planted a hedge or built a stone wall, and said, "This is mine, all of it, the grass, the trees, the rabbits, and even the weeds." Suddenly, the act of survival became a crime. Walking into the forest to pick mushrooms, that's trespassing. Gathering fallen branches for a fire, that's theft. Digging up roots in the meadow, that's destruction of property. The independent salad wasn't just unfashionable anymore, it was illegal. The wild pantry was locked, and the Lord held the only key. This shift transformed the peasant from a subsistence farmer into a wage laborer. This is a crucial distinction. A subsistence farmer works for himself to eat. A wage laborer works for someone else to get money to buy food. Once the commons were gone, you had no choice. You couldn't just live off the land because you didn't have any land left. You had to go to the Lord, hat in hand, and ask for a job herding his sheep or weaving his wool. You had to earn coins to buy the bread that you used to be able to bake yourself. The brilliance of this system, from the Lord's perspective, was that it solved the labor shortage. Remember how we said an independent peasant was a threat? Well, a landless peasant is very obedient. If you don't work, you don't eat. There is no backup plan. There is no sea kale in the ditch because the ditch is behind a fence. This brings us to the humble hedge. Today, we look at the beautiful, rolling hedgerows of the English or French countryside and think, how quaint, how scenic. We put them on postcards. But to a peasant in the 16th or 17th century, that hedge was a symbol of tyranny. It was a barbed wire fence made of nature. The hawthorn bush was the favored plant for these hedges because it grows fast and has vicious, long thorns. It was literally planted to hurt you if you tried to cross it. It was hostile architecture centuries before we started putting spikes on park benches. Historians still argue fiercely about the legacy of enclosure. The agricultural revolution proponents will tell you that it was necessary. They argue that the commons were inefficient. By enclosing the land, the lords could use better breeding practices, drain the swamps, and produce way more food for the growing cities. In this view, the independent vegetable had to die so that the industrial potato could live. It was the price of progress. But the social history camp argues that it was essentially a massive theft, a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich that created a permanent underclass. They point out that efficiency is cold comfort when you are the one starving on the wrong side of the hedge. Let's look at the Black Act of 1723 in England as a grim example of how far this went. This law made it a capital offense, punishable by hanging, to be found in a forest with a blackened face, i.e., camouflaged, carrying a weapon. You didn't even have to kill a deer. You just had to look like you might be thinking about hunting. The state was effectively saying that the life of a deer or a rabbit was worth more than the life of a peasant. The forest, once the grocery store of the poor, had become a death trap. This is where the forgotten vegetables truly met their end. Plants like Good King Henry or skirret thirst in the margins, the edges, the unkempt corners. Enclosure tidied everything up. It turned the landscape into a factory floor. Weeds were eradicated to make room for grass. The biodiversity of the commons was replaced by the monoculture of the pasture. And with the plants went the knowledge. If you can't pick the herbs, you stop teaching your children which ones are safe. If you can't access the roots, you forget how to cook them. Within a couple of generations, the green knowledge that had sustained your family for 1,000 years evaporated. It wasn't written down in books, it was written in the landscape. And when the landscape changed, the library burned down. So you stand on that hill, shivering in the wind. The sun is setting on the era of the independent peasant. You look at your hands, they are empty. You have no choice now. You turn away from the forbidden forest and walk down toward the village, toward the mill, toward the wage. You are going to apply for a job. You have become a modern consumer. The transition is complete. The wild, chaotic, resilient, dirt-covered world of the Middle Ages has been tamed. The vegetables have been categorized. The land has been fenced, and the people have been filed into the ledger. It is safer, perhaps. There is less chance of accidentally eating a poisonous hemlock root, but the freedom of the salad is gone. As we leave the muddy fields and the enclosed pastures behind, we are going to shift our gaze. We are moving from the control of the body, what you eat and where you walk, to the control of the soul and the heart. We are leaving the open air for the stone claustrophobia of the cloister. Because if you thought the laws regarding turnips were strict, wait until you see the laws regarding love. You are standing in a room that is exactly 6 paces long and 4 paces wide. The walls are made of gray stone, sweating slightly with the perpetual damp that seems to be the main architectural feature of the Middle Ages. There is a small window, but it's too high for you to see out of, or perhaps it looks out onto a blank wall. The air smells of beeswax, stale incense, and the sharp, vinegary scent of floor polish. We have moved from the enclosure of the land to the enclosure of the body. If the peasant's struggle was about fighting for the right to use the earth, the struggle inside these walls is about fighting for the right to be human. You are a nun, but let's strip away the Hollywood image for a second. You aren't a serene, middle-aged woman with a beatific smile and a love for choral music. You are likely 17 years old. And here is the kicker. You probably didn't choose this. In the medieval period, the convent wasn't always a destination for the spiritually gifted. It was often a storage solution for the aristocracy. It was a warehouse for surplus daughters. Here is the cold economic reality. Marriage in the Middle Ages was a business transaction. To marry off a daughter to a nobleman of equal or higher status required a dowry, land, money, plate, jewelry. If a father had 3 daughters, the first one might get a great marriage. The second one might get a decent one. But the third, the money is gone. The estate can't support another payout without going bankrupt. So what does he do? He pays a spiritual dowry to a convent. It is significantly cheaper than a marriage dowry. Think of it as the economy ticket versus business class. He drops you off at the gate, signs some papers, and effectively washes his hands of your financial future. You are now the bride of Christ, which sounds lovely in a sermon, but in practice it means you are locked in a stone box with 50 other women who also didn't really want to be there, waiting for the end of time. This is the concept of involuntary vows. The church law technically stated that no one could be forced into a monastery. You had to have a vocation. You had to say, I do, of your own free will. But let's be real. If you are 12 years old and your terrifying father tells you that you have a vocation, you have a vocation. If the alternative is being cast out onto the street without a penny, you take the veil. So you are standing in your cell, wearing a scratchy wool habit that creates its own microclimate of itchiness. You are enclosed. This is a literal theological and legal term. Clausura. Strict enclosure meant that once you walked through those doors, you never walked out again until you were carried out in a box. The world outside, the markets, the festivals, the changing seasons, the faces of your brothers and sisters ceased to exist. You were legally dead to the secular world. Now imagine the psychology of this. You are alive. You have blood pumping through your veins. You have the same desires, boredoms, and energies as anyone else. But you have been placed in a sensory vacuum. The monastery is designed to crush the individual will. The schedule is a relentless machine of prayer. You wake up at 2 a.m. for matins. You go back to sleep. You wake up at dawn for lauds, then prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Your life is chopped into 3-hour increments of chanting Latin psalms that you have memorized to the point where they have lost all meaning. It is a grind. It is the spiritual equivalent of working on an assembly line, but the product is salvation, and the supervisor is invisible. In this environment of extreme sensory deprivation, the human mind does something strange. It zooms in. When you can't see the horizon, you become obsessed with the crack in the floor. When you can't talk to new people, the slight change in tone of the nun standing next to you in the choir becomes a major dramatic event. When you eat the same bread and pottage every day, no independent salads here, sadly, a slightly burnt crust can ruin your week, or an extra spoonful of honey can feel like a religious ecstasy. Isolation amplifies emotion. It turns the volume knob of your internal life all the way up to 11. In the secular world, if you are annoyed with someone, you walk away. You go to the tavern. You look at a tree. Here, there is nowhere to go. You are trapped in a pressure cooker of intimacy with the same group of women, day after day, year after year. Every glance, every sigh, every rustle of fabric is analyzed, dissected, and felt deeply. The church fathers who designed this system, mostly men who lived in comfortable palaces or detached academic bubbles, thought that removing distractions would make women focus entirely on God. They thought the stone walls would act as a shield against sin. They were wrong. The stone walls didn't keep the world out. They just trapped the humanity in. Think about the concept of axidy. It was a specific sin identified by desert monks, often translated as sloth, but it was actually something much deeper and darker. It was a spiritual boredom, a crushing, suffocating listlessness. It was the feeling of looking at the stone wall and wanting to scream because nothing ever changes. In the convent, Axidius was the monster in the corner. It was the depression that came from realizing that your life was a straight, gray line stretching out to the grave. To fight this, the nuns created their own worlds. They found gaps in the system. They created hierarchies and cliques. The prioress wasn't just a boss, she was a queen bee. The duty roster wasn't just a schedule, it was a political battlefield. Who got to light the candles? Who had to scrub the latrines? These were the currency of power. And then there was the grill. This was the defining architectural feature of the enclosed nun. In the parlor, the parloir from the French word for to speak, there was a window where nuns could technically communicate with visitors, family members, or perhaps a delivery man. But the window was covered by a heavy iron grill, often backed with a black curtain. You could hear the voice on the other side, maybe smell the rain on their cloak, but you couldn't touch them. You couldn't see them clearly. This barrier was meant to protect your chastity, but in reality, it fetishized the outside world. It made everything beyond the grill seem magical, desirable, and dangerously close. It turned a conversation into a tease. So here you are, 17 years old, full of energy, locked in a stone box, wearing a uniform, chanting in a dead language, and surrounded by women who are just as frustrated as you are. The system says you should be a vessel of pure prayer, empty of self, but you are not empty. You are full. You are full of questions, full of resentment, and full of a desperate, clawing need for connection. You look at the sister sitting across from you in the refectory. She is chewing her bread slowly. She looks up and catches your eye. She doesn't smile. Smiling might be a breach of the rule of silence, but her eyes flicker. There is a spark there, a recognition. In a world where you are allowed to own nothing, not even your own body, giving your attention to someone else becomes the ultimate illicit gift. The authorities have taken your clothes, your name, and your freedom, but they haven't figured out how to stop you from feeling. The sun sets outside the high window, turning the gray stone to a bruised purple. The bell rings for vespers. It's time to march back to the chapel. It's time to sing the same songs. But as you line up, the hem of your habit brushes against the hem of the sister next to you. It's a tiny contact, a friction of wool on wool. But in the vacuum of the convent, it feels like an electric shock. The walls are high and the doors are locked. But the heart is a stubborn thing. It will find a way to break the rules, even if it has to do it in silence. You are kneeling on the stone floor of the chapel. It is 3 a.m. This is matins, the earliest and most brutal of the daily offices. The air is so cold that you can see your own breath puffing out in little white clouds, mixing with the smoke of the beeswax candles. The only sound is the rhythmic, drone-like chanting of 50 women reciting a psalm they could say backwards in their sleep. It is a hypnotic, gray wall of sound. But your mind isn't on the psalm. Your mind is on a tiny, folded square of parchment hidden inside your left sleeve, pressing against your wrist like a hot coal. We are entering the world of the particular friendship. In the rulebooks of medieval monasticism, specifically the rule of Saint Benedict or Saint Augustine, there is a lot of ink spilled on the dangers of a misita particularis. To a modern ear, particular friendships sounds lovely. It sounds like having a best friend. It sounds like having a ride or die. But in the convent, it was a crime. The logic was ruthlessly simple. You are here to love God. God is a jealous lover. If you love Sister Agnes more than you love Sister Beatrice, you are creating a hierarchy of affection. You are hoarding love. You are stealing emotional energy that belongs to the Almighty and spending it on a human being. The ideal nun was supposed to love everyone equally and indifferently, like a spiritual radiator that heats the whole room but burns no one. But you, kneeling there with your knees aching, know that this is impossible. You are a human, not a radiator. And in the crushing isolation of the cloister, the heart desperately seeks a target. So, you have formed a particular friendship. It starts with the eyes. Monastic rules often demanded custody of the eyes. You were supposed to keep your gaze lowered, looking at the ground to show humility. But the ground is boring, so you glance up. You catch the eye of a nun across the choir stall. A look is exchanged. It lasts maybe half a second, but in a world of silence that looks a conversation. It says, "I see you. I know you hate this chant as much as I do. We are in this together." Over weeks, these looks evolve into a secret language. A raised eyebrow during a sermon means, "This priest is droning on." A slight nod in the refectory means, "Save me a piece of cheese." It is a micro-rebellion. But eventually, the looks aren't enough. You need words. You need to communicate the chaotic, messy interior of your mind. But you can't just chat. The great silence is enforced at night, and during the day, unnecessary speech is a sin. So you become a smuggler. The medium of your rebellion is the brev, a little note. Writing materials are controlled substances in the convent. Parchment is expensive. It's made of sheepskin, remember the enclosure? And ink is kept in the scriptorium. You can't just walk into a Staples, so you improvise. Maybe you work in the scriptorium, copying religious texts. You accidentally cut a strip of off-cut parchment, a scrap that was destined for the bin. You pocket it. You steal a drop of ink, or maybe you prick your finger and write in blood if you're feeling particularly dramatic and teenage, which, let's be honest, many medieval nuns were. Or you use the medieval Snapchat, the wax tablet. Nuns carried small wooden tablets coated in black wax, used for taking notes or planning the liturgy. You use a bone stylus to scratch a message into the wax. The recipient reads it, smiles, and then uses her thumb to smooth the wax flat again, erasing the evidence forever. It is the perfect ephemeral messaging system. But tonight, you have a permanent note. You wrote it yesterday during the designated work hour while you were supposed to be embroidering an altar cloth. It contains dangerous sentiments, not necessarily scandalous by modern standards. It might just say, "I felt so alone during the reading today. Your presence is my only comfort." But in this context, that is high treason against the vow of detachment. Now comes the delivery. This is the spycraft of the cloister. You wait for the kiss of peace during Mass. This is the moment in the liturgy where nuns are instructed to offer a sign of peace to their neighbors. Usually, it's a stiff, formal bow or a chaste embrace. You turn to your friend. As you lean in, your hands brush together inside the voluminous folds of your sleeves. The transfer happens. The parchment slides from your sweaty palm to hers. It is faster than a sleight of hand magician. Nobody saw it. The abbess, sitting in her high chair like a hawk watching for mice, missed it. Your heart is hammering against your ribs. The adrenaline rush is incredible. You have just successfully trafficked unauthorized emotion right under the nose of God. Later, she will read it. Maybe she will hide it in her straw mattress, which is essentially a sack of prickly grass, and read it by the light of the moon filtering into the dormitory. Or maybe she'll read it in the latrine, the one place where privacy is guaranteed. Historians have found these letters. They are fascinating because they are often written in a code that is a mix of spiritual longing and romantic obsession. They use the language of the Song of Songs, the biblical poetry about love, to mask their feelings. A letter might say, "My soul thirsts for your spiritual company like the deer thirsts for water." To the censor, it looks like a pious expression of religious community. To the recipient, it means, "I miss you, I love you, talk to me." This creates a gray market of intimacy. There is an ongoing academic debate about the nature of these relationships. Were they sexual? Mainstream historians often use the term romantic friendships to describe intense, emotional, but non-sexual bonds that were common in pre-modern history. They argue that we shouldn't project our modern categories of sexuality onto 14th century nuns. However, let's be realistic. You put a bunch of repressed people in a locked box for 40 years, things are going to happen. There are penitential manuals, essentially rule books for confessors, that list specific questions to ask nuns about impure touches and scandalous affections. The church wouldn't have written specific laws against it if it wasn't happening. You don't make a law against riding unicorns. You make a law against stealing sheep, because people are actually stealing sheep. But whether these relationships were physical or purely emotional, the threat they posed was the same. They created a private world. If you and your friend have a secret, you are no longer fully part of the collective. You have a loyalty that competes with the order. There is a sensory richness to these particular friendships. Think of the small gifts exchanged. A nun might smuggle a sweet apple from the pantry to give to her friend. She might embroider a small flower on her friend's handkerchief. These are tiny, almost invisible gestures. But in a life of gray wool and cold stone, a red apple is a diamond. A stitched flower is a manifesto. The danger of getting caught adds a layer of intensity to the bond. You are partners in crime. Every time you exchange a glance that the prioress doesn't see, you are winning a small victory against the institution that is trying to erase your personality. It's almost morning now. The chanting of matins is finally winding down. You stand up, your knees cracking, your feet numb from the cold stone. You look across the aisle. Your friend is there. She touches her sleeve, a subtle signal. She has the note. A warmth spreads through your chest that has nothing to do with religious fervor. You are trapped, yes. You are owned by the church, yes. But you have a secret. And as long as you have a secret, a part of you is still free. You file out of the chapel in silence, your head bowed, looking like the perfect obedient nun. But inside your head, you are composing your reply. You are kneeling again, but this time, the context has shifted. You are not on the cold stone floor of the open chapel surrounded by your sisters. You are in a wooden box. It is tight, claustrophobic, and dark, smelling of old cedar and the accumulated breath of 1,000 sinners. To your left, there is a small, latticed window covered by a curtain. You are in the confessional. And on the other side of that thin partition sits the most dangerous person in your world. It's a man. To understand the sheer gravitational pull of the confessor, you have to remember the context of your isolation. You haven't spoken to a man who wasn't a relative or a delivery boy in 10 years. You live in a world of women, governed by women, surrounded by the soft, high-pitched acoustics of the female voice. And then, once a week, he arrives. The priest. The confessor. He rides in from the outside world. He brings with him the smell of rain, of leather saddles, of stale wine, and of the dust of the road. He smells like freedom. He smells like the other. In the sensory vacuum of the convent, his presence is a nuclear event. He is the only source of testosterone in a 10-mile radius. But he is more than just a man. He is the gatekeeper of your soul. In the theology of the time, he is standing in persona Christi, in the place of Christ. He holds the keys to binding and loosing. He has the power to scrub your soul clean or leave it stained. When you speak to him, you aren't just chatting. You are engaging in a metaphysical, legal proceeding where the stakes are eternal. This creates a power imbalance so steep it would make a modern HR department spontaneously combust. You kneel there, in the dark, and you whisper your sins. I was angry at Sister Joan. I was lazy during lauds. I had a distracting thought about a turnip. It feels intimate. The very architecture of the confessional is designed to force intimacy. You are whispering. He is leaning in to hear. His ear is inches from your mouth, separated only by a piece of cloth. The danger arises when the conversation shifts, and it often shifts. There is a specific term in canon law for what happens next: solicitatio ad turpia, solicitation to sin. The church spent centuries writing laws about this because it was the open secret of the clerical world. The confessional, designed to be a place of repentance, was frequently the perfect venue for grooming. Here is how the trap works. It starts with spiritual direction. You are vulnerable, you are lonely. You tell him about your spiritual dryness, your laxity, your boredom. He listens. He is sympathetic. He tells you that you are special. He tells you that your soul has a unique sensitivity that the other nuns, and certainly the strict Mother Superior, don't understand. You and I, he whispers through the grill, we are on a higher spiritual plane. We share a mystical marriage of souls. It is the ultimate gaslighting maneuver. He reframes emotional dependency as spiritual progress. If you feel a flutter in your chest when he speaks, he tells you it's the Holy Spirit. If you want to spend hours talking to him instead of praying, he tells you that is a form of prayer. Historians and theologians debate the nature of these relationships endlessly. Some argue that many of these priests truly believed their own hype. They thought they were engaging in a high-minded, platonic spiritual union. They were mystics, exploring the frontiers of divine love. Others take the more cynical view. These were predatory men using their absolute authority to access vulnerable women who couldn't say no. Because really, how do you say no to the man who holds the keys to heaven? If you reject his spiritual friendship, will he refuse you absolution? Will he tell the Mother Superior you are rebellious? Will he tell God on you? The confessor becomes the wedge that splits the convent. Remember that particular friendship you had with the other nun in the last section? That was a peer-to-peer rebellion. You were equals. But this is hierarchical. The priest encourages you to trust him over your sisters. He becomes your secret ally against the convent rules. Don't worry about the fasting rule, he might say. Your spirit is too delicate for that. I give you a dispensation. Now you are special. You have a secret deal with the boss. It isolates you further from the community and binds you tighter to him. We have records of visitations, official inspections by bishops that read like soap opera scripts. They found convents where the confessor was essentially running a harem. There were curtains removed from confessionals. There were private interviews that lasted for hours in the sacristy. The emotional manipulation was often more damaging than the physical risk, though the physical risk was real. But consider the mind game. You are trained from birth to be obedient. Obedience is the prime virtue of a nun. To disobey a priest is to disobey God. So when the priest suggests that your intimacy is God's will, your defense mechanisms are already dismantled. You don't have the vocabulary to fight back. And let's look at the sensory details of the seduction. It's rarely overt at first. It's a gift of a holy card. It's a lingering hand on your head during a blessing. It's the tone of voice, that soft, murmuring baritone that vibrates through the wooden partition. In a world of silence, a voice that speaks only to you is a powerful drug. There is a fringe historical theory that suggests some of the famous mystical ecstasies recorded by nuns, visions of angels, piercing arrows of love, physical tremors, were actually sublimated sexual responses to these intense emotional relationships. When you can't have a boyfriend, you have a vision. When you can't have sex, you have a rapture. The body keeps the score, even if the theology tries to erase it. But for you, kneeling in the dark, it doesn't feel like history or psychology. It feels like a lifeline. He asks you how you are really doing. He uses your baptismal name, not your religious name. He treats you like a woman, not a generic unit of prayer. You find yourself living for that weekly visit. You curate your sins, saving up interesting ones just to keep the conversation going. You invent spiritual crises just to get his advice. You are starved for affection, and he is feeding you crumbs, but crumbs taste like a feast when you are fasting. Eventually, the line crosses. Maybe he suggests you meet him in the garden to discuss a difficult theological point. Maybe he passes a note through the grill, and this is where the terror sets in. Because if you get caught, the consequences are not distributed equally. He is a priest. He is a man. If a scandal breaks, he might be moved to a different parish. He might be sent on a pilgrimage. He might get a stern talking to from the bishop. But you are the temptress. You are the Eve who led Adam astray. The structure of the church protected the institution, and the institution was male. If a nun and a priest broke their vows together, the narrative was almost always that she seduced him. She was the siren behind the grill. So you stay silent. You keep the secret. You let the spiritual direction twist into a knot of guilt and desire in your stomach. You kneel in the box, listening to his breathing on the other side, and you realize that you are trapped in a second enclosure within the first one. The stone walls keep you in the convent, but the confessional box keeps you in his pocket. The slide of the wooden shutter signals the end of the session. Go in peace, he says. But there is no peace. There is only the waiting for next week, and the slow, creeping realization that the person who is supposed to save your soul might be the one who steals it. You are standing in the chapter house. It is a large, rectangular room with benches lining the walls, usually located right off the cloister. This is the boardroom of the convent, the place where business is discussed, but every morning it turns into a courtroom. The air is tense. The Mother Superior sits at the front in a large, intimidating chair that looks uncomfortably like a throne. You and your sisters are gathered for the chapter of faults. This is the daily ritual of self-criticism. In theory, it is a beautiful exercise in humility. You stand up and say, I was late for matins, or I broke a bowl in the kitchen. You receive a light penance, maybe saying an extra psalm, and you sit down, cleansed. But today, the atmosphere is different. Today, the secret note was found, or maybe the whispered conversation in the garden was overheard. Today, the machinery of monastic justice is turning its gaze toward you, and you realize that this system was not built for rehabilitation. It was built for erasure. The punishments of the medieval convent are a fascinating study in how to crush the human spirit without technically drawing blood most of the time. The church had a rule: Ecclesia non sedit sanguinem. The church does not thirst for blood. This meant they couldn't execute you. They couldn't chop off your hand. So instead of physical destruction, they perfected the art of social death. If your crime was minor, the punishment was public humiliation. This is the weaponization of awkwardness. You might be sentenced to eat your meal sitting on the floor of the refectory, while the other sisters sit at the tables. It sounds childish, like a timeout for toddlers, but imagine the psychological weight of it. You are a grown woman. You are surrounded by your peers, and you are forced to sit in the dust, eating dry bread, while everyone else averts their eyes. You become an object of pity and disgust. Or perhaps you are sentenced to the prostration. You have to lie face down across the doorway of the chapel. As the other nuns file in for prayer, they have to step over you. Some might step carefully. Others might let the hem of their heavy wool habit brush against your face. You are literally being walked over. You are the doormat of the community. It is a physical manifestation of your status. You are lower than the lowest. But let's say the crime is serious. Let's say the particular friendship crossed the line, or the relationship with the confessor was discovered. Now we move from humiliation to containment. You are taken to the cell. Every monastery had a prison. They called it the carcer. Sometimes it was just a locked room in the infirmary. But in older, stricter houses, it was a dark, windowless hole beneath the dormitory or near the kitchen. You are stripped of your habit, your identity, and given a rough, gray tunic. You are led into a room that is maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. The door is heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands. The lock clicks shut with a sound that feels like a physical blow to the chest. Welcome to the diet of the bread of tribulation and the water of anguish. That is the actual liturgical term for it. It wasn't just starvation, it was a theological menu. You were given just enough heavy, coarse bread and stagnant water to keep your biological functions running, but not enough to give you energy to rebel. It was a caloric deficit designed to induce a state of docility. When you are starving, you don't plot escapes. You fantasize about cheese. Your world shrinks to the size of your stomach. And then there is the silence. You thought the great silence of the convent was quiet? The silence of the prison cell is heavy. It presses against your ears. There is no chanting here, no bells, just the sound of your own breathing and the scratching of rats in the straw. There is a grim, scholarly debate about just how far these punishments went. You may have heard Gothic horror stories about nuns being walled up alive, immured in a niche in the wall with a brick and a bottle of water, left to die. This makes for great tour guide stories and bad horror movies. Most mainstream historians argue that literal, fatal immurement was extremely rare, practically a myth. The church didn't want martyrs, they wanted penitents. However, there is a punishment called the Vaden Pace. It translates to go in peace. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? It sounds like a blessing. In reality, the Vaden Pace was a permanent life sentence in solitary confinement. You were put into a cell, and the door was locked, never to be opened again. You received food through a small slot. You heard mass through a small grate. But you never saw another human face. You were told to go in peace, essentially, go die quietly, so we don't have to deal with you anymore. You were a ghost while your body was still warm. The cruelty of this system had a distinct gender bias. If a monk or a priest committed a serious sexual sin, his punishment was often mobile. He might be sent on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He might be transferred to a monastery in a different country. He was circulated. But a nun? A nun could not be circulated. A wandering nun was a scandal in itself. A woman outside the walls was loose, in every sense of the word. So while the men were sent away to walk off their sins, the women were walled in to suffocate theirs. The solution to female transgression was always compression. Squeeze them into a smaller box, make them invisible. The ultimate nightmare, the scenario that kept every abbess awake at night, was pregnancy. Biology is the one thing you can't gaslight. You can interpret a look or a note however you want, but you can't interpret a baby out of existence. If a nun became pregnant, perhaps by that spiritual director we talked about, the convent went into crisis management mode. The goal was not justice. The goal was secrecy. The reputation of the house was worth more than the life of the mother or the child. We have historical accounts of nuns wearing tight lacing and bulky winter habits all through the summer to hide the changing shape of their bodies. Imagine the physical agony of that. Corseting a pregnancy while working in the garden, fainting in the choir, terrified that if you fall, the secret will be out. When the baby came, the tragedy deepened. If the convent was lenient, the child might be smuggled out to a wet nurse in a distant village, listed as an orphan. The mother would never see it again. If the convent was strict, or panic set in, well, archaeology has occasionally found the tiny bones of infants buried in the unconsecrated ground near convent walls. But let's step back from the edge of that darkness. You are in your cell. It has been 3 weeks, or maybe 3 years. Time has dissolved. The bread is stale. The water is tepid. You sit on the straw mattress, staring at the single ray of light coming through a crack in the masonry. You watch the dust motes dancing in the beam. This is your television. This is your entire universe. The purpose of this isolation was technically reform. It was supposed to give you time to think about your sins. And you do think, but you don't think about God. You think about the wind on your face. You think about the taste of a roasted onion. You think about the feeling of that parchment note in your sleeve. The punishment doesn't make you holy. It makes you hollow. It hollows you out until you are just a shell of obedience, ready to be filled back up with the rules of the order. Eventually, the door might open. You might be allowed back into the community. But you are different now. You are broken in the way a horse is broken. You walk with your eyes on the floor, not because the rule says so, but because you are afraid to look up. You have learned the lesson of the stone walls. You are small, and the system is stone. As the key turns in the lock, echoing with a finality that settles deep in your bones, we leave the damp, silent halls of the medieval convent. We are going to travel further back in time, to a place where the sun is hotter, the wine is stronger, and the approach to love and desire is not about repression, but about magical, chaotic control. We are going to the ancient Mediterranean, and we are going to diagnose a disease called love. We are leaving behind the damp, gray stone of the medieval convent and stepping out into the blinding white light of the Mediterranean sun. The air has changed completely. It no longer smells of mildew and incense. It smells of hot dust, roasted lamb, drying oregano, and the salty tang of the Aegean Sea. You are wearing a linen tunic that allows the breeze to pass through, and your sandals are kicking up little puffs of dirt as you walk through the agora of ancient Athens, or perhaps the Forum of Rome. But despite the sunshine, there is a sense of dread in the air. You aren't here to buy olives. You are here because you are sick, you are feverish, you can't eat, you can't sleep. You feel a strange burning sensation in your chest, and your thoughts are spiraling in a repetitive, obsessive loop. In the modern world, we would call this having a crush. We would send a few risky texts, listen to a sad playlist, and wait for it to pass. But here, in the ancient world, you have been struck by a serious pathology. You are suffering from eros. You have the disease of love. It is crucial to understand that the ancients did not view falling in love as a soft, cozy experience involving rom-com montages and coffee dates. They viewed it as a catastrophe. It was an invasion. It was a hostile takeover of the rational mind by a chaotic external force. Look at their mythology. We tend to think of Cupid, or Eros, as a chubby, harmless baby with tiny wings on a Valentine's card. That is a Victorian invention. The ancient Eros was a terrifying, primordial god. He was often depicted as a young man, lean and dangerous, armed with a bow. And that bow wasn't a metaphor for tickling your fancy. It was a weapon of war. When Eros shot you, it was an assault. The arrow pierced your eye, which the ancients believed was the entry point for desire, and traveled down into your soul, where it started a fire. The language used by poets like Sappho or philosophers like Plato wasn't about butterflies in the stomach. It was about violence. Sappho describes love as a wind rushing down on oak trees. It breaks you. It strips your leaves. It describes a thin fire racing under the skin, a buzzing in the ears, a blindness. These are not the symptoms of happiness. These are the symptoms of a stroke. So when you felt this happening, you didn't just journal about it. You panicked. In a society that prized self-control, stoicism, and reason above all else, falling in love was the ultimate loss of dignity. It meant you were no longer the pilot of your own ship. You were being steered by a biological storm. This is why the ancients treated love as a medical issue. If you went to a doctor in 2nd century Rome, complaining of insomnia, racing heart, and loss of appetite, he wouldn't tell you to download a dating app. He would take your pulse. There is a famous story about the physician Galen, the most influential doctor of the Roman Empire. He was called to treat a woman who was wasting away. She had no fever, no infection, no visible wounds, but she was dying. Galen sat with her and began to talk, mentioning various names of people in the city. When he mentioned the name of a certain dancer, her pulse suddenly hammered against his fingers like a trapped bird. Galen didn't diagnose a virus. He diagnosed a passion of the soul. The prescription wasn't rest. It was obtaining the object of desire, or finding a way to purge the emotion. This medicalization of desire tells us something fascinating about their worldview. Love was a physical substance. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a matter of hydraulics. The ancient medical theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, governed everything. Health was balance, sickness was imbalance. Love was a severe imbalance. It was often associated with heat and blood. The heat of desire was believed to literally boil the blood and melt the marrow of your bones. When a poet wrote, "I am melting for you," they meant it literally. They believed their internal organs were liquefying under the thermal stress of attraction. This helps explain why they were so obsessed with cures. If love is a fever, you need an aspirin. If love is a poison, you need an antidote. And this is where the dark side of ancient romance emerges. Because love was seen as a force that happened to you, like a lightning strike, the goal was often to regain control. You could try to cure yourself of the love, an aphrodisiacs, or more often, you could try to force the other person to catch the disease too. If you are suffering and the object of your affection is walking around happy and healthy, that is an injustice. It is an asymmetry. So you don't write them a poem. You go to a sorcerer or a root cutter, the ancient pharmacist, and you ask for something to level the playing field. You want a tool that will infect them with the same fever you have. We often think of aphrodisiacs today as fun little additions to a romantic dinner. Oysters, chocolate, maybe some strawberries. They are recreational. But in the ancient world, aphrodisiacs were functional tools of coercion. They were chemical weapons in the war of the sexes. The word aphrodisiac obviously comes from Aphrodite, the goddess of love. But Aphrodite wasn't just the goddess of beauty. She was the goddess of the impulse to procreate. She was the force that made the trees bloom and the animals mate. She was nature's biological imperative. And nature is not polite. Nature is aggressive. So the substances used to invoke her power were not gentle. They were often bizarre, violent, or downright toxic. The logic of asympathetic magic ruled the pharmacy. This is the belief that like cures like, or that an object that looks like a body part will heal or affect that body part. If you wanted to increase masculine virility, you ate the organs of a virile animal. If you wanted to entrap a woman, you used something that symbolized binding or heat. Standing in the dusty market, you might see a vendor selling small dried lizards, or jars of unidentifiable paste, or strange new human-shaped roots hanging from the ceiling. These aren't ingredients for a stew. They are munitions. The anxiety surrounding these love cures was palpable. Men terrified of impotence, which was seen as a catastrophic failure of civic duty and masculine honor, would pay fortunes for anything that promised vitality. Women, terrified of losing their husband's interest, and therefore their economic security, would risk poisoning their families to slip a potion into the wine jug. It was a high-stakes game. There was no FDA regulating the love potions. If the root cutter gave you the wrong dose of a hallucinogenic plant, you didn't just fall in love, you fell dead, or you went insane. And this brings us to the central irony of the ancient view of love. They built temples to it. They wrote epic poems about it. They started wars over it, looking at you, Helen of Troy. But personally and individually, they were terrified of it. They treated it with the same wariness we might treat a radioactive isotope. Powerful, useful if handled correctly, but mostly just dangerous. As the sun beats down on your neck, you feel a bead of sweat trickle down your spine. You look at the statue of Eros in the corner of the market. He is freezing a marble arrow in his marble bow, aiming at some unsuspecting shopper. You realize that to the ancients, we are all just targets walking through a firing range. The sun is setting now, casting long red shadows across the white pillars of the temple. The heat of the day is breaking, but the heat of the night is just beginning. And in the shadows of the apothecary's shop, people are gathering to buy the things they hope will save them from the terrible, beautiful disease of desire. We are about to look at the inventory of that shop, and be warned, The first item on the shelf is not a box of chocolates. It is a root that screams when you pull it out of the ground, and it might just kill you before you ever get a second date. You are standing in the back room of the apothecary's shop. It is darker here, away from the street. The air is thick with a smell that is sweet, cloying, and slightly rotting, like lilies left in a vase for a week too long. The shopkeeper, a man whose hands are stained with green juice and brown earth, reaches under the counter. He doesn't pull out a jar or a bottle. He pulls out a box lined with velvet or perhaps soft moss. He opens it with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics or very expensive jewelry. Inside, lying on the moss, is a root. At first glance, it looks like a parsnip that has seen some terrible things. It is brown, wrinkled, and bifurcated, meaning it splits into two thick legs at the bottom. But as your eyes adjust to the dim light, the resemblance becomes undeniable. It looks like a little, shriveled person. It has legs. It has a torso. Sometimes, if the root cutter has been creative with his knife, it even has a face carved into the top. This is the mandrake, Mandragora officinarum. In the ancient pursuit of love, this wasn't just an ingredient, it was the nuclear option. If you were desperate enough to buy this, you weren't looking for a casual fling. You were looking to alter reality. The mandrake is the most famous plant in the history of magic, primarily because it sits at the terrifying intersection of sex, death, and biology. The logic behind its power comes from the doctrine of signatures, a philosophical theory which stated that the creator had stamped every plant with a clue about its purpose. Walnuts look like brains, so they cure headaches. Mandrake roots look like naked human bodies. Therefore, they control the human body. Specifically, they control fertility and desire. It was the ultimate proxy. If you possessed the root, you possessed the person. But acquiring a mandrake wasn't as simple as digging up a carrot. This plant came with a body count. You've probably heard the legend, perhaps from a certain wizarding school movie, but the ancient reality was far grimmer. The folklore stated that when a mandrake was pulled from the earth, it would scream. This wasn't a metaphorical scream. It was a sonic blast of such agony and horror that anyone who heard it would instantly drop dead or go permanently insane. The plant was so connected to the earth, so semi-human, that tearing it out was an act of murder, and it retaliated. So how did the ancient root cutters get it? They outsourced the risk. Imagine the scene. It is midnight. You are in a desolate field, likely near a gallows, because folklore insisted that mandrakes grew best where the fluids of hanged men had dripped onto the ground, a detail that adds a lovely layer of macabre fertility to the whole operation. You dig around the root carefully, exposing the top but leaving the taproot firmly stuck in the soil. Then you bring in the patsy, a dog, ideally a hungry dog. You tie a cord around the top of the mandrake root and tie the other end to the dog's collar. You throw a piece of meat or bread just out of the dog's reach. Then you cover your ears with wax, wrap your cloak tight around your head, and run. The dog lunges for the meat. The cord goes taut. The root is ripped from the ground. The mandrake screams. The dog drops dead, sacrificed for your libido. Historians and botanists still debate whether the ancients literally believed this, or if it was the world's first brilliant marketing campaign. Think about it. If you are a root cutter, you want to charge a fortune for this root. If you tell everyone that harvesting it requires a midnight ritual, a dead dog, and a risk to your own life, you can charge a premium. It's a supply chain scarcity tactic. It turns a vegetable into a luxury hazard. It also keeps the amateurs away. If digging up the root kills you, the average peasant isn't going to try it in his backyard. But once the root was out of the ground and the unfortunate dog was disposed of, the real danger began. Because the mandrake isn't just a weird-looking root. It is a member of the nightshade family, the Solanaceae. It is a cousin to the potato and the tomato, but it is the evil cousin who went to prison for poisoning people. The root is packed with tropin alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. These aren't vitamins. They are powerful psychoactive compounds. In low doses, mandrake acts as a sedative and an anesthetic. In fact, ancient surgeons used it to knock patients out before amputations. It puts you in a twilight state where pain feels distant. But in slightly higher doses, it is a deliriant. This is where the love aspect gets dark. We tend to think of aphrodisiacs as things that make you feel romantic. Mandrake didn't do that. It made you hallucinatory. It caused a state of erotic delirium. Users reported sensations of flying, of transforming into animals, or of engaging in wild, frenzied encounters that may or may not have been happening in reality. The ancients, in their quest to cure the disease of love, were essentially drugging themselves or their targets. If you slipped mandrake into someone's wine, you weren't seducing them with your wit. You were chemically dismantling their inhibitions and their grip on reality. You were rendering them pliable. There is a distinct, slimy texture to the history of the mandrake. The fruit of the plant, small, yellow-orange berries that look a bit like unripe tomatoes, were known as love apples, a name later transferred to the tomato, which caused a lot of confusion. These were supposed to be milder, a fruit you could keep under your pillow to encourage conception. In the book of Genesis, Rachel trades her son's mandrakes for a night with her husband Jacob, highlighting how far back this fertility association goes. But the root was the heavy artillery. It was often carved into a talisman and kept in a box, dressed in little clothes like a doll. You would treat it like a pet. You would bathe it in wine, which it would absorb, and in return, it was supposed to bring you love, money, and power. However, the line between an aphrodisiac and a poison is purely a matter of dosage. In ancient quality control was non-existent. One root might be mild, the next might be lethal. The symptoms of mandrake poisoning are classic anticholinergic effects. Blind as a bat, mad as a hatter, red as a beet, hot as a hair, dry as a bone. Your vision blurs, you hallucinate monsters, your skin flushes, your temperature spikes, and your mouth goes so dry you can't speak. It's not exactly the romantic evening you planned, yet people took the risk. Why? Because the mandrake offered the illusion of control over the uncontrollable. Love is chaotic, so its rejection is painful. Infertility is a tragedy. The mandrake, with its human shape, looked like a solution. It looked like a little homunculus that you could own, a human spirit trapped in vegetable flesh that you could command. Imagine you are that person in the apothecary shop. You have paid a week's wages for this shriveled brown root. The shopkeeper wraps it in a cloth for you. He warns you to be careful with the dosage. A scrap the size of a fingernail, he whispers, no more. You walk out into the cool night air, the root heavy in your pocket. You feel powerful. You have the screaming root. You have the thing that killed a dog. You have the magic that can force the object of your desire to notice you. But as you walk, you might wonder about the ethics of what you are doing. You are planning to spike a drink with a hallucinogenic neurotoxin to simulate affection. It speaks to a profound loneliness in the human condition, doesn't it? The fact that we would rather have a drugged, hallucinating partner than no partner at all. We would rather brave the scream of the mandrake than the silence of an empty bed. And there is a final, darker twist. Some legends say that the mandrake doesn't just scream when it leaves the earth. It screams because it knows the future. It knows the misery it will cause. It knows that the love it produces is artificial, a chemical trick that fades as soon as the alkaloids wear off, leaving you with nothing but a headache and a very confused partner. But you push that thought away. You touch the pocket of your tunic. The root is warm, almost like it has a pulse. You head home to grind it into a powder, ready to mix the potion that will cure your lovesickness, or perhaps just start a whole new nightmare. You are standing in the shadow of a temple portico, but the air here doesn't smell like incense or flowers. It smells like a slaughterhouse. It is the heavy copper-scented air of the sacrificial pit. The stone beneath your sandals is sticky. We have moved from the vegetable magic of the mandrake to something far more visceral. We are entering the realm of biohacking, the Bronze Age edition. If you were a man in ancient Rome or Greece, your existence was defined by one thing: potency. It wasn't enough to just be alive. You had to be a generator of life. You had to produce heirs to inherit your property. You had to produce citizens for the state. You had to demonstrate virilitas. If you couldn't, you were a ghost. You were a broken link in the chain of ancestors. Impotence wasn't just a medical dysfunction, it was a civic failure. It was the ancient equivalent of declaring bankruptcy, but for your gender. So imagine the panic. You are a Roman patrician. You have the villa, the toga, the clients waiting in the atrium. But in the bedroom, nothing. The engine won't turn over. You don't go to therapy. You go to the bull. The bull was the undisputed heavyweight champion of ancient symbolism. He was pure, unadulterated testosterone on 4 legs. He was aggression, fertility, and power wrapped in 1,000 pounds of muscle and bad attitude. In the logic of sympathetic magic, that idea that you are what you eat, the bull was the ultimate battery pack. If you were feeling weak, you didn't need rest. You needed to steal the bull's energy, and the carrier of that energy was the blood. In the ancient mindset, blood was the vehicle of the soul. It was the liquid that carried the pneuma, the vital spirit. To drink the blood of a bull was to mainline its essence. It was an attempt to perform a direct blood transfusion of masculinity. But this wasn't something you picked up in a bottle at the store. Freshness was the key. The magic was in the heat. Picture the scene. It is a festival day, perhaps the Toropolia. The bull is led into the ring. It is decorated with garlands of flowers, which is a dark irony considering what is about to happen. The priest strikes the blow. The animal falls, and you are there with a cup. You have to drink it warm. Let's pause to consider the sensory reality of this. We are used to liquids that are smooth, cold, and carbonated. Warm, fresh blood is none of those things. It is thick, it is viscous. It has a metallic tang that coats the back of your throat, like you've been sucking on a handful of old coins. It is salty, heavy, and incredibly difficult to swallow. As it hits your stomach, it sits there like a lead weight, a warm, churning reminder of the violence you just consumed. It is the ancient equivalent of a protein shake from hell. But as you wipe your mouth, trembling slightly from the adrenaline and the sheer grossness of the act, You tell yourself it's working. You feel a flush of heat. Is it the virilitas of the bull flooding your veins, or is it just your body's natural fight or flight response to ingesting a massive amount of iron and foreign protein? It doesn't matter. You feel different. You feel dangerous. There is a fascinating and murky debate among historians about the safety of this practice. If you read the ancient plays like those of Aristophanes, or the histories involving the general Themistocles, bull's blood is actually described as a lethal poison. The legend goes that Themistocles committed suicide by drinking a bowl of bull's blood. So was it a cure or a killer? Scholars have spent a weird amount of time trying to figure this out. Modern toxicology tells us that bull's blood isn't inherently poisonous. It's not cyanide. You can eat black pudding. You can eat a rare steak. However, blood coagulates instantly. If you drink a large bowl of it rapidly, it can form a massive clot in the throat or stomach, effectively choking you or causing a catastrophic digestive blockage. There is also the risk of bacteria. In a world without refrigeration, blood goes bad in minutes. If the bull was sick, or if the blood sat for an hour in the hot sun, it became a septic cocktail. So the cure was a gamble. It was a game of Russian roulette played with a goblet, and that danger was part of the appeal. To cure your impotence, you had to brush up against death. You had to prove you were strong enough to digest the essence of the beast. If you survived the drink, you deserved the erection. It was a test of manhood disguised as medicine. But the obsession with the bull didn't stop at just drinking the blood. It got weirder. In the later Roman Empire, specifically with the cult of Cybele and Attis, there was a ritual called the Taurobolium. This was the spa day version of the blood cure. You didn't just drink a cup, you took a shower. You would dig a trench and cover it with wooden planks that had holes drilled in them. You would strip off your clothes and stand in the trench, in the dark, under the floorboards. Above you, on the planks, they would sacrifice the bull. The hot blood would rain down through the holes, soaking you completely. You would turn your face up, letting it cover your eyes, your mouth, your skin. When you climbed out of that pit, red and dripping, you were considered reborn. You were revitalized. You were literally coated in the power of the animal. Imagine the walk home, the blood drying on your skin, turning stiff and brown, cracking as you move, the smell of iron following you like a shadow. You are a walking piece of bio-horror performance art. But to your neighbors, you look like a man who has taken control. You look like someone who has conquered the weakness of the flesh. This practice highlights the extreme lengths men would go to in order to maintain the illusion of invulnerability. The patriarch could not be weak. If his body failed, he had to borrow a body that wouldn't. He had to outsource his vitality to the animal kingdom. It also reveals a deep insecurity at the heart of the ancient world. For all their statues of marble gods with perfect bodies, for all their philosophy about the triumph of reason, they were terrified of their own biology. They knew that at any moment the body could just stop working. The machine of masculinity was fragile, so they tried to fix it with the most aggressive masculine substance they could find. It's the same logic that leads modern men to buy supplements with names like Rhino Force or Gorilla Tea. We haven't really changed. We've just changed the packaging. We still want to believe that if we consume the essence of a powerful animal, we will inherit its power. We want to believe that strength is something you can swallow. As you walk away from the temple, your stomach churning with its heavy metallic load. You hope it works. You hope the bull is coursing through you. You hope that tonight you will be a beast. But deep down, as the sun sets and the adrenaline fades, you just feel a little sick. You realize that you are not a bull. You are just a man with a stained tunic and a desperate need to believe in magic. The bull is dead, and you are still just you. You are reclining on a couch, Electus, propped up on your left elbow. The air is perfumed with rosewater and saffron, masking the scent of the oil lamps that flicker against the frescoed walls. You are at a Roman dinner party, a convivium. After the trauma of the bull's blood and the screaming mandrake, this feels like a significant upgrade. There is no mud here. There are no frantic dogs. There is only marble, mosaic, and a slave approaching you with a silver platter. On the platter rests a pile of rough, gray rocks. They look like debris from a construction site. But the slave uses a small knife to pry one open, revealing the glistening, pearlescent creature inside. The oyster, Ostrea edilis. If you stop to think about it logically, the oyster is a hard sell. It is a biological filtration system that lives in the mud. It looks like a glob of gray mucus. It has the texture of a cold lung, and yet, for the Roman elite, this was the absolute pinnacle of desire. It was the venerable face of desire. You tip your head back. You let the creature slide from its shell. It hits your tongue, cold, slippery, and shockingly salty. It tastes like you just licked a wave. And then, with a single gulp, it is gone. Why did this slimy rock become the heavy artillery of romance? It starts, as most things do in Rome, with a goddess. Aphrodite, or Venus to the Romans, was not born in a hospital or a house. She was born from the sea foam, Aphros. Botticelli painted her standing on a giant scallop shell, arriving on the shore of Cyprus. The shell was her vehicle. It was the womb that delivered beauty to the world. Therefore, in the magical logic of the ancient mind, eating a shellfish was like taking communion with the goddess of sex. You were consuming the very element that created her. You were eating the sea womb. But the Romans were also practical people, and they had a medical justification for everything. Galen and the other physicians classified foods by their humors. We talked about how the bull was hot and dry, providing masculine fire. The oyster, conversely, was the ultimate source of moisture. In ancient biology, sexual fluids were seen as a form of purified moisture. If you were dry, you were impotent. You were a husk. But to be fertile, you needed to be juicy. The oyster is nothing but juice. It is life suspended in brine. By eating it, you were literally replenishing the reservoirs of your body. It was hydration with a sexual purpose. But let's be honest, the real aphrodisiac wasn't the biology. It was the price tag. Nothing makes a Roman more excited than eating something that was incredibly difficult to get. And oysters were a logistical nightmare. They spoil instantly. If you eat a bad oyster, you don't just get a stomach ache, you get a visitation from the Furies. You die of cholera or typhoid. So to serve fresh oysters in Rome, which is inland, required a supply chain that rivaled a military campaign. Enter Sergius Orata. This man is one of history's great forgotten geniuses, the Elon Musk of shellfish. In the early 1st century BC, Orata realized that relying on wild oysters was for peasants. He invented oyster culture. He built massive artificial oyster beds at Baiae, a resort town on the coast that was basically ancient Las Vegas. He created a system of hydraulic engineering using heated baths, hypocausts, to control the water temperature and ensure his oysters bred year-round. He turned a scavenger hunt into an industry. He became fabulously wealthy, proving that sex sells, especially when it comes on a half shell. But the Romans didn't just want local oysters, they wanted British oysters. When the Romans conquered Britain, they didn't just find woad-painted warriors, they found the Austria Aedilis of the Kentish coast. These were considered the gold standard. They were sweeter, firmer, and larger than the Mediterranean variety. Now consider the logistics. To get a fresh oyster from the coast of England to a dinner table in Rome took weeks of travel. They had to be packed in ice, harvested from mountains and stored in caves, and transported in special tanks that were constantly refreshed with salt water. By the time that oyster reached your lips, it cost more than a slave. When you swallowed a British oyster, you weren't just eating seafood, you were eating the empire, you were consuming the conquest, you were demonstrating that your reach extended to the very edge of the known world. That kind of power is, arguably, the most potent aphrodisiac of all. There is a delightful scholarly debate about whether the Romans actually liked the taste, or if it was pure performance. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who hated everything fun, ranted about oyster gluttony. He described the gourmands who would eat hundreds of them at a sitting, vomiting them up just to eat more. He called oysters slime perfectly fattened. He has a point. The texture is challenging. But the Romans leaned into it. They didn't mask it with cocktail sauce and horseradish like we do. They might add a dash of garum, fermented fish sauce, which is basically adding fish juice to your fish rock, doubling down on the ocean funk. But did they work? Modern science actually throws the Romans a bone here. Oysters are incredibly high in zinc. Zinc is essential for testosterone production and sperm quality. They also contain rare amino acids, D-aspartic acid, that trigger increased levels of sex hormones. So unlike the bull's blood, dangerous, or the mandrake, hallucinogenic, the oyster was actually a legitimate dietary supplement for fertility. The Romans didn't know about zinc, of course. They just knew that after a tray of 20 oysters, they felt ready. But there is a darker psychological layer to the oyster dinner. It represents the slippery nature of luxury. The oyster is there, and then it is gone. It is a moment of pure consumption that leaves nothing behind but an empty shell. It is the perfect metaphor for the Roman approach to pleasure. Consume everything, hoard the experience, and leave a pile of debris. You look around the dinner party. The host is bragging about how these oysters came from a specific bed in Britannia. He is signaling his status. The guests are slurping them down, eyes glazing over with the combination of wine and protein. It is a scene of excess. But notice the texture of the interaction. The oyster is a food that mimics a kiss. It is soft, wet, and intimate. To eat one in front of someone is a suggestive act. It is a safe way to perform sexuality in public. You aren't touching anyone, but you are engaging in a sensory experience that mirrors the bedroom. Women, too, were encouraged to eat them. This was rare. Usually, hot foods were reserved for men. But because the oyster was cold and moist, it was safe for women. It wouldn't make them too aggressive, which the Romans feared. It would just make them fluid and receptive. It was the only aphrodisiac that was truly unisex. As you swallow your 12th oyster, feeling the cold weight of it settle in your stomach, you feel a strange sense of detachment. You are part of a machine of consumption. You are eating the sea, eating the money, eating the myth. The candlelight flickers on the empty shells piled high on the silver platter. They look like a graveyard of little skeletons. You realize that this entire evening, the expensive wine, the imported shellfish, the rose petals, is a fortress built against boredom. The Romans conquered the world, but they couldn't conquer the quiet terror of a dull evening. So they filled the silence with the most expensive noise they could find, the slurping of shellfish from an island 2,000 miles away. The venerable face of desire turns out to be a blank, gray shell. It promises everything: fertility, pleasure, status. But it doesn't love you back. It just sits there, waiting to be consumed. As the slave clears the table, preparing for the next course, perhaps dormice dipped in honey, because why not? You feel the heavy, drowsy buzz of the zinc and the wine. You are ready for love, or at least, you are ready to sleep. But we have one final stop on this journey. We have eaten the vegetables of the poor, survived the prisons of the nuns, and consumed the luxuries of the rich. Now, we must look at the final, overarching truth of all these desperate attempts to control our biology. We have to ask, did any of it actually work? Or were we just scaring ourselves to sleep? You are walking home. The market is closed, the temple is dark, and the apothecary has locked his door. The heavy meal of oysters and the strange metallic aftertaste of the cures you've consumed are settling into a dull ache in your stomach. The sun is rising over the ancient city, painting the marble in shades of soft pink and bruised purple, but you don't feel triumphant. You feel tired. We have spent this entire journey looking at tools of control. We looked at how feudal lords tried to control what peasants ate by banning independent vegetables. We looked at how the church tried to control who nuns loved by building stone walls. And finally, we looked at how the ancients tried to control desire itself with blood, roots, and shellfish. But as the dawn breaks, we have to face the uncomfortable truth that links all these stories together. The illusion of control is the most expensive drug of all. Consider the aftermath of the love potion. Let's say you gave that mandrake powder to someone. Let's say you slipped the hippomanes, a truly gross substance derived from horses that we didn't even have time to get into their wine. What actually happens? Best case scenario, they get dizzy, their face flushes, and they become pliable. They might agree to go to bed with you. But have you created love? No. You have created a zombie. You have chemically induced a state of compliance. The ancient Greeks, for all their obsession with magic, were smart enough to recognize the tragedy of this. In their myths, love potions almost always lead to disaster. Deianira gives a love potion to her husband Hercules to keep him faithful, and it turns out to be a corrosive poison that burns the flesh off his bones. It's a heavy-handed metaphor, but it lands. When you try to force affection, you destroy the person you are trying to keep. The Roman legal system eventually caught up to this reality. In 81 BC, the dictator Sulla passed the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius et Veneficius. This was a law regarding assassins and poisoners. Crucially, the Romans used the same word for poison, drug, and magic potion, venenum. The law didn't distinguish between a wife who poisoned her husband to inherit his money and a wife who gave him a love potion that accidentally stopped his heart. If the medicine killed him, it was murder. Intent didn't matter. The state recognized that tampering with someone's biology to hack their emotions was a form of violence. This brings us back to the fear. Why did we do all of this? Why did we ban the spirit? Why did we imprison the nuns? Why did we eat the mandrake? Because humans are terrified of variables we cannot solve. Agriculture is scary because the rain might not come. So the lords created a system where they owned the labor, trying to engineer certainty out of chaos. But the weeds kept growing. The sea kale kept thriving in the shingle, proving that life finds a way around the fence. Social cohesion is scary because people are unpredictable. So the church created the enclosure, trying to engineer holiness by removing temptation. But the human heart kept beating. The notes were passed in the sleeve. The glances were exchanged in the choir. The particular friendships proved that connection finds a way through the stone. And love? Love is the scariest thing of all. It is the ultimate vulnerability. It is handing someone a knife and hoping they don't cut you. So the ancients tried to engineer guarantee. They wanted a receipt for their affection. They wanted a transaction. I pay 1 drachma for the root. I get 1 unit of love. But the universe doesn't work like a vending machine. The mandrake gave them delirium, not devotion. The bull's blood gave them indigestion, not virility. There is a profound irony in the story of the lost vegetables we started with. We spent centuries trying to eradicate them, calling them pig food and weeds. And now elite chefs forage for sea kale and charge $40 a plate for it. Hipsters grow lovage in urban gardens. The very things we tried to suppress have returned as status symbols. The same is true for the nuns. The strict, silent convents of the medieval period are mostly gone or radically changed, but the letters remain. The poetry of the mystics, women who found their voice despite the silence, is now read as some of the greatest literature in history. The suppression didn't erase them, it pressurized them into diamonds. And the aphrodisiacs, we still hunt for them. We just changed the venue from the temple to the pharmacy. We still want the pill that fixes loneliness. We still want the hack that makes us irresistible. We are still the same scared, lonely creatures standing in the dark, hoping that if we just buy the right thing, we will finally be safe from rejection. But standing here in the morning light, you realize that the disease of love, the chaos of the garden, and the disorder of the human heart are not bugs in the system. They are the system. The chaotic, uncontrollable nature of life is what makes it worth living. If you could force the wheat to grow perfectly every time, it would be a factory, not a farm. If you could force a nun to stop feeling, she would be a statue, not a saint. If you could force someone to love you with a potion, you would be alone in a room with a mirror. The boring history of our species is largely a record of us building walls to keep out the storm, only to realize that we need the rain. So you drop the imaginary mandrake root. You let it fall into the dust of the road. You don't need it. You don't need the validation of the bull or the permission of the Lord. You are just a person, standing in the stream of time, watching the currents of history flow past you. The anxiety of the what if begins to fade. You realized that you survived the famine without the white bread. You survived the silence without the confessor. You survived the night without the potion. The desire to control everything is a heavy armor. It takes so much energy to wear it, to constantly patrol the borders of your land, your soul, and your relationships. As you walk toward the horizon, where the sun is now fully up, washing the world in gold, you decide to take the armor off. You let the weeds grow. You let the heart break. You let the world be wild. And in that surrender, finally, there is peace. Now, Let the images of the past dissolve. The medieval fields of wheat and sea kale are fading into a soft, green mist. The stone walls of the convent are crumbling, turning into harmless dust that blows away on a gentle breeze. The bustling markets of Rome, the shouting merchants, the clattering chariots, they are all silencing one by one, like candles being blown out in a long hallway. You are no longer a peasant, a nun, or a Roman. You are just you. You are safe in your own time, in your own space. The struggles of history cannot touch you here. The hunger of the famine is gone. The cold of the cell is gone. The heat of the fever is gone. Feel the surface beneath you. It is supportive and steady. You don't need to control it. It holds you without you having to ask. Relax your jaw. Let the tension drain out of your shoulders, flowing down your arms and out through your fingertips. Imagine that heavy armor of control we talked about, the need to manage every outcome, the need to predict every future, just unbuckling and falling away. Clang, clang, clang. It drops to the floor, leaving you light and free. You are drifting on a quiet sea. There are no storms here, no oysters to harvest, no ships to steer. You are just floating. The water is warm and dark. The sky above is vast and starless, a velvet blanket of nothingness. Let your breathing slow down, in and out, in and out. The history is written. The book is closed. There is nothing left to do. There is nothing left to solve. Just the quiet, just the dark, just the drift